Okay. Yeah, this is one I probably should have gotten to, at least title-wise, at other times in my life. But it came to mind today, and hey, I've got the camera set so that I don't have anything else on it. That makes life easier. In this case, I started thinking, maybe because I'm reading Indonesia, about the problem of corporations. In particular, what got me started was the idea of the limited liability corporation, which very obviously is, a tremendous benefit for the investor. But like all things in life, you're shifting something somewhere else. And in this case, at least some of the profit that investors make in a limited liability corporation, maybe taxes are the remedy for this, but are already in place essentially, as long as the corporate tax is higher than the individual tax. But the problem is you're shifting risk in terms of the people who are putting the money up are no longer at risk for something that massively impacts the world, or massively impacts the town if it's a smaller company or something along those lines. Because only the corporation's assets are, in place, in play if there's a lawsuit or something. Obviously there might be, individual liabilities for decisions, etc., at least on the criminal side. But sure, if the corporation can probably, you can make individual liabilities, but the whole issue is the investors are not liable for more than what their investment is worth. Now, if I owned a plumbing store, and I just own it, I don't incorporate or anything, and someone slips and falls, I may well have to pay out of my own pocket for that. Obviously it's nice, I'm gaining something, and I don't think the fees for turning into a corporation pay for that risk. Obviously it's really nice for me if I incorporate and protect myself and shield myself from that risk. But then who is assuming that risk? And I'm making profit off of, off of operating with that risk in play, right? I'm able to make riskier decisions because now my money's not quite as threatened. My livelihood's not as threatened. Yeah, I stand a lot to lose, but there are limits to what I stand to lose once I am a corporation. And most specifically, if I'm just an investor who owns some through a hedge fund, through a share fund, or through, I'm not quite sure what happens with hedge funds, or selling short. Who's owning that share at the point? And all these kinds of mechanisms of the financial system are kind of based on this idea. Obviously, it wouldn't work if you took this core principle away, but there's a scam going on. There's a scam of letting the public assume a certain amount of the risk that normally wouldn't have been that way. And the question I kind of have is, okay, well, if that's the case, then it ought to be stated kind of explicitly, some boundaries put on it, and some kind of fee collected that's commensurate with whatever we're talking about. So, again, this is a tax type issue. And I don't think that any kind of, drilling rights, deprecation of assets or anything like that should be able to be applied to this tax for very obvious reasons. Whatever portion of the taxation of corporations may cover this has to be exempt from any kind of reimbursements from the tax code for a very specific reason, which is that the public has assumed a risk due to this corporation, right? And some of the biggest corporations for this are, you've got your natural resource extraction companies, which often get the biggest benefits in terms of because of the way the royalties taxes on these things are assembled, etc. They just happen to have a lot of little breaks in there that prevent them from, if there is any coverage of this risk, which I'm not even sure there really is. It's not explicit in the tax code as far as I know. There's not a, hey, you're operating this business and we've assessed your risk at this, and we've got kind of this boundary here and we need to protect the public from that risk. And in some cases, how can you possibly do it? But that's what insurance companies kind of do. So there should be some sort of protection for the public as a whole from these things. And what instead happens is you have things like Superfund, where the public as a whole starts paying in advance, knowing that they're going to get screwed. Well, maybe it's not the public. Maybe it's not the public that's responsible here, right? And maybe because corporations are not, indefinitely lived things with infinite resources, maybe they should be putting up some estimated value continuously. And again, you can't really legislate, or you shouldn't really be legislating that somebody has to buy insurance, but something like Obamacare would actually make sense here, where there's a public risk in play, and that's identified, and now you either have to buy an insurance to cover it or just pay the government to cover it, and either one works fine. Anyway, there was something I wanted to look at. Yeah, so by starting to look at corporations in this way, where they're not really things that people invested in and that they're responsible for, they've achieved this kind of life of responsibility of their own, which is where you get the corporations are people too type crap, right? Now, whether or not they should have a free speech right, well, they shouldn't, right? I mean, this is not the natural order upon which the Constitution and other, and the Declaration of Independence, the rights documents of that era were based. They didn't look at it and say, corporations should be able to do this. But clearly, if you're a media organization, or if you want to do, if you want to make statements about your products, etc., you have to be treated in a certain way, kind of like a person. And then the question becomes, well, how much? Well, here's the thing. The investors are the people. And if you didn't cut them from the liability, right? If you didn't try to segment the corporation into an entity that's not made up of its investors and their efforts, then you could easily assign the free speech rights by the investors. They hold those free speech rights. And, to some extent, they express those through their voting, etc. However, the investors aren't subject to criminal liability in general. They're not subject to financial liability beyond the value of their stock. And but this has some interesting implications too, because a company that's doing particularly poorly, right, and maybe close to the edge and having difficulty meeting its payments, maybe it's over leveraged, and this is the precise company, the one that you least want to have a problem, the one that you least want to default or to be shoddy and cause an injury. These are the ones the most likely to start cutting corners and taking risks. Because honestly, they're on this knife edge of my stock is either worth nothing or it will keep being valuable, and there's a big difference between the two. And it's still worth nothing if we're a little bit weaker on protecting the rules. And, and to a large extent, the protection, following rules like an OSHA rule or something like that, people don't usually go to jail when those get screwed up, right? What generally happens is the company gets a big fine. Okay, well, that gets figured into your risk metrics. Your bean counters look at it and say, okay, we won't look as hard. Not sure what happened there. I think it was a battery death. But, your bean counters look and they say, we're not going to look as hard. Is it a conscious decision? No. But a lot of those kind of decisions are very much based on just the attitudes of emails and stuff like that. And it's stuff that people are not going to be criminally held for. Just sort of that's not really that big a deal. We'll file it here, and, So, what ends up happening is a lot of information just, you become sloppier in your information collection. You put less money into that because that's a cost sink on its own, and then it creates a cost sink in terms of, trying to protect, trying to remediate the actual issues that are found. Now, certainly there's some danger of fines, but a lot of times what businesses are most worried about is sort of a reputational damage of, what happens if it's found out that we got fined by OSHA and this, that, and the other. And that factors into it, but that risk sort of gets cleared away when you're looking at a life or death situation for the business. It's kind of like, if somebody breaks into your house and you shoot them, you're not terribly worried about what the legal implications are going to be at the moment you're pulling the trigger. You're fucking scared for your life, or your property or whatever. And in the same kind of way, the corporate climate gets to be kind of a panic type situation where you're looking, where can we cut costs? Okay, we exceed the requirements here. Let's A, stop doing that because we know we do, and B, stop looking as hard at the requirements because obviously we're doing a good job. And you get all this kind of, overswing in these kind of cases. But that doesn't matter when you're on that balanced knife edge of, am I going to exist or not, right? And therefore, the companies that are least able to actually pay for damages that they could incur are the ones that are most likely to cause them. And again, it's why you need to take the protection up front with, and I'm not just talking environmental problems, which the Superfund has. I'm talking about across the board, You never know what is going to happen, what you're going to be at fault for. And without some kind of requirement to do so, certainly a business isn't going to want to pay into some sort of insurance fund for this kind of thing. It isn't going to help their reputation, for example. All it's going to do is shield assets which may not actually exist for the most part. Anyway, I'm sure I've got a lot more to talk about in this case, but in terms of corporations as a whole, but I'm particularly worried about that limited liability issue and what the effects are. Now, if you look at the modern period, and by that, of course, I mean, since like the 17th century, mid-17th century, you start to see this tremendous growth upwards. And a lot of that has to do with this concept of the limited liability corporation, with the concept that yeah, the government will assume, and the people will assume some of the risk and some of the damages that you cause. And in general, and there are other factors, obviously, but in general, it's been a positive force. So it would be ridiculous to step back to sort of a medieval view of how to treat things, even if that seems fairer and more just. It would not be ridiculous, however, to rein that in a little bit and have the government clearly identifying what public burden is being taken on to whatever extent they can, and make legitimate decisions as to whether or not the public needs to be protected from them. And this is especially important in the current era, where there's the danger of, well, you see it on a smaller scale with things like the huge oil spills and such now. But there's a danger built in with global warming, with ecological destruction. It's a question, of course, what liability should be undertaken by the threat of war, because at least if you look to the 19th century, it's quite often the case that countries went to war over what were private interests. The U.S. certainly did it quite a few times. So where, you're kind of putting citizens and other and the flag essentially at risk. What does that mean? So if you're taking behavior that maybe the State Department says, you probably shouldn't be going into this country, we don't really trust the government there, and there's a risk that there's going to be a coup and all private assets will be seized. Well, obviously the corporation has a problem with that, but if you take a look at what the effect, say, into the 20th century of that kind of behavior in Cuba was, it had an incredible cost on, U.S. Business and policy. Just because certain corporations lost a lot of money in Cuba, an embargo was placed, which prevented other trading opportunities, etc. And that whole cost was probably much, much greater than the cost of the seized assets. Certainly from the public point of view, if not from the private view of the investors. So, if there's a risk that, foreign policy might switch in a way detrimental to the public as a whole, it's important to consider whether or not certain business interests are a risk to, the whole populace just because of any of these kind of decisions. And it's such a broad area, I'm not even sure how you would kind of try to define it, but honestly, actuaries do stuff that I don't know how they do that either. So my assumption is that you can get some kind of feel for the overall risk and start assessing things to it. And it'll, of course, become politicized. But, the idea here is, if there's a certain level of counting on the government to intervene, to clean up a spill, to take care of an emergency situation like, where there's huge flooding because of some issue, if there's a fire, emergency responders have to handle that. That's public taking on a responsibility there that, might be larger than otherwise. And make it an abstract. It doesn't make a lot of sense to kind of charge each person or each individual, but an abstract based on the risk level of the business that they're performing. Of course, this was dangerous because what do you do then when people are exercising their rights that are also riskier than the average? Should they also be feed for that somehow? It starts to get into a really ugly question there. But at the very least, it strikes me that corporate entities seem to be getting away with more than an individual would be able to in too many ways. And we need to at least be honest about that. If we decide the public will assume that risk, well, we should be aware of what the risk is. I mean, you can't take on a risk without knowing what it is, right? You shouldn't just blithely say, well, I'm just walking, I'm in no danger, and ignore the fact that you're walking across a busy street against the light. All right.